Hey guys, so as usual, I wanted to provide a tier list of the best meta and rogue decks for the month of March using duel and book data from YGeoScope as well as topping information from YCS level and regional level events. And before I continue, definitely go check out my discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as supplies, all of the information in the description below. Now before we get to the meta tier list, definitely as usual, a big shout out to Ivan as well as YGOProduct.com for really collecting all of the information on the topping decks at the regional and YCS level. Anyways, for this month, we are of course starting with Fire King. I mean, I don't think that's really a surprise for anyone. It is by far, along with the Snake Eye stuff, really the best deck in the format, getting the most amount of YCS tops, regional level tops, what have you. It's incredibly strong, it's incredibly resilient, and just in terms of its amount of power to be able to come back after its board gets wiped, or even also having not only a way to set up a strong board, but also in terms of OTKing with like the Zealantis line, really strong. So next we have Pure Snake Eye, which of course hand in hand with Fire King is, the best deck of the format. I mean, realistically, Fire King is where it's at because of the Snake Eye stuff, and it's incredibly strong. Again, I think these two decks are just on a tier on its own. You can call it tier 0, you can call it tier 1, what have you. I'm just going to move everything else into the tier 2 section. So then moving on to tier 2, we have Voiceless Voice, which has a decent amount of YCS and regional level tops. I mean, nowhere near the level of Fire King or Snake Eye, of course, but compared to the other decks listed in this tier 2 section, it's actually in a much better spot. And so, being able to go and put up an Omni Negate and like some targeting protection, battle protection, it does it really consistently too. It can struggle a bit against something like Droll and, of course, Shifter, but that's applicable to pretty much every deck. But other than that, I think it's pretty solid. And of course, there are some variations, like some people have played with like branded stuff. I think a very small number of decks that topped actually played with the branded stuff, and I personally dabbled with that as well. I do think it's probably just best to play like one way or the other. And then talking about branded, we have branded Despia. This, especially at a regional level, has been doing quite well. I mean, people have kind of talked about, it's a decent matchup against Fire King Snake Eye. I mean, sure, I guess it has some unique advantages. I mean, Fallen Valba summon can be pretty good too, especially because they don't actually have like Appaloosa up right away. It's like IP first that they go through. And of course, something like, let's say, Mirror Jade, like non-targeting banish is nice. Branded opening, card destruction protection can come up as well. It's still going to be an uphill battle against something like Fire King Snake Eye. Like, they are really strong. But I think especially when branded Despia gets to go first, and with like the gimmick luck, I do feel very confident in those games as well. So I do think that it can still put up its own, but it's not like a cakewalk, obviously. Otherwise, it would be topping a lot more. So Gimmick Puppet or Sanctifier probably will get the ban at some point, especially once, some of the Fire King Snake Eye stuff gets hit. But, for a deck that's like pretty competitive, it is fairly affordable, quote unquote. Again, understanding that, quote unquote affordable means still a few $100s. I do think it's a solid deck. Next we have Cashier. This of course, kind of like Shifter-like decks is going to be pretty strong in a format where Fire King, Snake Eye, they struggle against something like Shifter. Like Cashier Unicorn is really strong. I also find, at least among the times that I've been playing them, they don't seem to play into like Nibiru. They just like seem to summon 4 and pass, which is like really annoying. I mean, obviously if they go into like the Heat Soul line, I'm assuming Nibiru will come up. But nonetheless, along with something like Shifter, and Cashier Birth is also still a very strong card. So I do think this deck is quite solid still. Similar to that is another Shifter deck in Flunder. Again, I mean, anytime you have a deck like Fire King, Snake Eye, or let's say back in the tier 0 format with Tealance, when you have decks like that struggle against Shifter that are so dominant, you're always going to see Flunder come back. And, being able to thrust into a Featherstorm, which didn't exist, but like a year ago, that's always nice too. So then you have Rescue, which is, it's fallen down a lot compared to where it was just like a month ago before Phantom Nightmare came in. It was like by far the best topping deck. But I'm not sure if other people also were able to predict how far it would have fallen. I still thought it would do pretty well, but I guess people just felt that, if you're going to play a Fire deck, you might as well play Fire King / Snake Eye. So perhaps that's the reason, I guess, with, I don't know, with Voiceless Voice, they have some targeting protection too. Perhaps like the traps for Rescues aren't as strong in that regard as well. But yeah, certainly let me know if you're playing this deck in the current format and how it's been faring. So then we have Pearly, and so this is another deck that's been kind of slept on lately, right? Especially after some multiple banlist hits. But I actually recently did a profile with Jason who finished top 4 at a regional with Pearly. He was talking about how, for example, people aren't really playing like the books anymore as they were even in like not that long ago, really. So getting into X Pearly Noir, probably a little bit more successful. On top of that, I'm seeing them also side like something like Dimensional Fissure, which is pretty strong against, especially against something like Fire King, and also a lot of different decks out there. And then we have Mannadium. This is another deck that I kind of had high hopes for going into like this format. I guess Droll was just too strong. It is seen, as I mentioned earlier, in a lot of different lists, and a lot of them main decking it as well. So perhaps it's a little bit hard for Mannadium, even though they're typically playing something like Crossout as well. And then Labyrinth is another deck that's been a bit of a disappointment, at least, you know, in that brief period between Maze of Millennia and Phantom Nightmare. Even during that period, they didn't do anything really in terms of regional level tops, nothing significant at least, especially with like, you know, transaction rollback, and people are kind of freaking out with, you know, how strong Labyrinth is going to be, especially because they didn't get any kind of hits on the ban list. But, you know, yeah, still, especially now we're in a Fire King format, Labyrinth's just not doing that well. A lot of people, everyone really is playing Ashe, as you would have seen in that YCS Top Cup breakdown. They're still also playing Bell as well, which just really hurts Labyrinth a lot. So then moving on to sort of Rogue, we have Tearlaments. You know, this deck just does not die, and I just feel like anytime I face against Tearlaments, they seem to put up the same board anyways with that Agido and Kel deck, so I think it can be still quite strong in terms of the layers of interruption that they can put up. But again, as we talked about, you know, when you have Fire King, Snake Eye, like, so being so dominant, you're gonna have decks that are playing Shifter, which always kind of sucks against, for Tearlament players at least. But you know what, other matchups wise, I'm sure it's still pretty decent. I think, again, it is a pretty scary deck. So then we have Centurion, which has fallen quite a bit in terms of representation, but, you know, not really fault of its own. Again, it's just more so Fire King Snake Eye just being so dominant. Centurion was actually doing pretty decent leading into Phantom Nightmare format. I'm sure it will still do fine. They're getting some new support at some point eventually. Hopefully Calamity Lock will be banned by then at that point, and, you know, you have other hits to like some of the top decks. I think Centurion, super consistent, can play a lot of hand traps. Typically, they play also like the horror stuff, which is, you know, still pretty strong. So I think this deck still has promise, just maybe not in this current format. Next we have Unchained, which is a deck that doesn't see as nearly as much play since the Shavara hit, of course. At the same time, I guess you could argue, you know what, they actually still did get a decent amount of regional tops leading into Phantom Nightmare format after that ban list. Right now in the current format, not, you know, it's still got some tops. Presumably it's probably not the best time for them when, you know, you're in a format with like Fire King, which tends to also plus if they get popped. Next, you have Dragon Link, which has certainly taken off a lot of fall back in terms of representation. Bystials, it's kind of an interesting position right now. Originally, I think the play of Bystials went down a lot because we have a lot of fire decks, but lately, if you saw that YCS Vegas Top Cup breakdown, there were actually several decks siding Bestial, Magma, and like Druid's Worm and what have you, because I guess, you know, for example, you could like, I don't know, banish something like IP in the grave when they try to put it with like Flamberge or something. So I guess there's actually still some application for Bestials, and Dragon Link, of course, can use Bestials better than any other deck can, but, you know, really in its place in the meta compared to when something like Tearlaments, Unchained were like some of the better decks, really not at that position anymore. And then you have Chimera, which has really fallen off hard, and, you know, among the branded decks, it used to be the sort of the quote-unquote better option, but now, you know, Despia is far better for this current format. Chimera, though, is still pretty solid, though, especially when it gets to go first, and also budget-wise, this is definitely a really strong choice as well, so something you can consider if you're looking to get back into the game or kind of starting the game from the beginning. Next, we have Raid Raptor. This is a pretty cool choice. I did feature a few regional topping Raid Raptor profiles on my channel itself, so you can definitely go check those out. Going first, I think this deck is really scary. I could play through several interruptions, but most importantly, you know, being able to set up multiple towers, it's going to be hard to out for a lot of different decks out there. And on top of that, you know, some decks, of course, can do like the whole Kali Yuga lock, which kind of similar to like Calamity Lock. You know, I mean, like, you can't really do anything if that does resolve, so that's unfortunate. But I do see that, you know, some of these topping decks aren't actually playing that route, so I think going second, at least depending on the build, you can still play a decent amount of hand trips as well, so you still have some chance there. Next, we have Vanquish Soul. This has been struggling quite a lot lately in this current format, I'm assuming because, you know, they do need kind of like their bodies to be on the field and go into rock and kind of start their plays, and, you know, you have just a lot of pop based interruptions right now. They can play Shifter though, which is kind of a plus, but for the most part, you know, it still has a few regional tops, but not doing nearly as well as it was the previous format. And then kind of similar lines is Sprite. They can also play Shifter, not optimally, but they can still play it. Just the downside is, you know, as I mentioned multiple times now at this point, Sprite does also struggle really hard when it's going second and they, you know, they have their bodies popped. Otherwise, you know, Sprite is pretty good traditionally going second, being able to OTK and everything, but, you know, they still need their level 2s to stick on the board, and with Fire Kings they can kind of get rid of that pretty easily. So not a great time for them. They're really not doing well at a YCS level or even at the regional level at this point. And finally, we have Sword Soul. We actually had a couple decks top so far in this post Phantom Nightmare format. I know at least one of them, they were main decking Shifter to kind of have a chance against Fire King. I know they were doing that in Tier 0 Tearlament format as well. I know they don't really play optimally under it, but they can still at least play it, I guess, and it kind of gives them a fighting chance. And also, from a budget standpoint, probably like the cheapest deck that can top a regional too. And then finally, we have Hero, which is actually had a decent amount of regional tops leading into Phantom Nightmare format. Post Phantom Nightmare, not that many, only one known top so far. But you know, Dark Law, Banish is pretty strong against something like Fire King, so at least they have a kind of a shot there. And I think it's just cool in general that Heroes, among like the anime kind of decks, you know, like Dark Magician, Blue Eyes, Heroes has always been the most competitively reliable deck for a very long time. Alright guys, so that was it for the tier list by the data for this month. Hopefully you found that interesting. I know it's a little bit more straightforward this time around just because Fire King and Snake Eye dominate pretty much every tournament, but hopefully you're still finding ways to have fun in this current format. But anyways, huge thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons as well for the continued support, and well, take care guys.